Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyard, where we are listening through the entire Bible in a year. My name is Bern and Leckie. I'm joined by Owen Lynch.
Hello.
This week, we've been listening to a couple of books, maybe contrasting books in the style and the tone, but they've got a very similar theme. The books of Lamentations and Daniel. What did you make of those, Owen?
Yeah, Lamentations, traditionally, as a Christian, has been a book that we've often looked to for help and identification with suffering, and clearly that is the case. I felt the pain of it. I maybe identified it a little bit from moments in life where I felt suffering and just felt the anguish and the kind of isolation that often comes with suffering. Daniel, on the other hand, I don't know about you, but it feels very familiar, very, very familiar, which maybe we'll talk about in a minute, but just a real sense of familiarity with the story of Daniel. Maybe it was because I was, at Sunday school, Daniel was a favourite of the Sunday school teacher.
Yes. Yes, there might be books that you wouldn't kind of think to lump together in your head necessarily, and until you listen to them together, and I think realising then that they are written at a very similar time. They're written to God's people in a situation that we've been spending quite a few weeks thinking about and listening to different writers' angles on, the exile of God's people from their homeland. Some scholars think that Lamentations might have been written by Jeremiah, and the pain that's expressed is very specific to this being cut off from hope and all these things that they think they ought to be attached to. Let's start with Lamentations. How does it grab you as sort of unusual then? Is it just because we don't do a lot of this these days, or is it just hard to relate to, or what is it about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that it's true to say that when we think about Lamentations and we think about this culture that it's come from, it reminds me that suffering in silence is not a virtue in this book. Suffering in community is what this piece of writing is all about, and as I understand it, this was written at about the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. It would have been horrific. I mean, sometimes it's really difficult to kind of imagine what life would have been like back in these days, but just imagine the worst obliteration by a foreign power destroying your city. I mean, we're very lucky that we live in the UK and we've not experienced that in our lifetime, but certainly there are people around the world that are experiencing that now, and they would definitely be able to identify, I think, more with this than we do. But this is written at a time of great personal and national suffering, particularly for this city of Jerusalem and the residents thereof. So I think there's what I find about it is that there is no virtue in suffering in silence, which actually is in contrast to perhaps our more stoic British kind of culture of kind of biting our lip and not letting other people see our emotions. Maybe that's why it feels slightly alien to us. But certainly this was a culture that were willing to express their suffering, and I think we can learn something from that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the craft of it which gets lost in the English,
that's true.
And completely lost when we're listening to it and not seeing any structure in it. It's very much like Psalm 119 that we listened to a few weeks ago, because the way it's ordered in the original language is by all the letters of the alphabet, all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The first 4 chapters anyway are all sort of acrostics. They start with consecutive letters of the alphabet and take you through then this suffering and this pain, which is immense, and it goes through the depths of feeling, but also somehow then manages to bring some order into it, which I think is the strange thing to reflect on. Like would that be the thing that if we were just in pain and crying and hurting and crying out, would we think to start our first sentence with an A and then with a B and then with a Z? What effect would that have if someone did that in English? Would it feel kind of weird and cheesy? Or I think the effect it might have had here was to communicate just the breadth of suffering, the order that people could still find and look for in chaos. Maybe as their faith was built on all these psalms that they've been singing and practicing for a long time, and used to meeting God in those moments, bringing the pain, but also finding some hope somewhere. Maybe that was a sign that God was still present and God was still ordering people's thoughts, including especially people's suffering and people's pain. God wasn't cut off from it. He was maybe involved with it more than we can understand just from hearing it the way we've heard it this week. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion, that the author structured it in that way, such to communicate something of God's order in the midst of great disorder. That is an interesting point. I find chapter 4 really interesting, where it contrasts the past with the present. And the present, of course, being them living in the middle of the destruction of Jerusalem, and where it says in verse 2, how the precious children of Zion, once worth their weight in gold, are now considered pots of clay, the work of a potter's hands. There's just a real strong contrast there for the author about what life was like before the destruction of Jerusalem, and now what they're experiencing. And there's real beauty in this, even though it's painful to listen to. I agree with you. There's definitely some purpose in mind. And with that in mind, something you just said earlier on, Bern, just triggered a thought in me. It's interesting, isn't it, how many of the books we've been listening to in the latter part of this year, we've talked about scholars saying that largely these books were written around about the same sort of era, about this time of exile, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were taken off into exile by the Babylonians. So much of the stuff we've been listening to was written at that time.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think some of that might just be down to how much was gathered together of things that were shared orally way before that. But at what point in life do you feel the urge to write down your life story?
Yeah.
If you're going through a crisis, if you feel that it's now is the time, maybe it's now or never, we've got to write all this down. I suspect there was quite a lot of crisis and a lot of sense of we need to have our code written down. We need to pass on what it is we've learned from God all these years. And so I think scholars tend to agree that while a lot of what is in the Old Testament is very, very old, a lot of it didn't reach its form that it's passed to us in until perhaps about the time of the exile, maybe a bit before, maybe a bit during, maybe a bit after. And so there are certainly common themes in there. Also, God's really grabbing people's attention with the exile as well. It's clearly a defining event in the history of nations, and not just Israel, because Israel had split and was looking for, what's going to happen then? Could they come back together? Israel had also been promised by God to be a light for the world, so we were hoping and expecting to have much more significance than just the suffering they were going through. And I love that this. We've also said in previous episodes how in ancient texts sometimes the point, the climax, the really important thing is right in the middle, not saved to the end as a zinger, but it's in the middle. It's the heart of what around everything else that is built around it. And I think in Lamentations, right in the middle chapter, verse 22, there is this particular ray of hope that is, I think, the defining thing, and then everything else is just almost looks like it's lying in ruins around this one brilliant bit of glorious hope. But it's one that I think we relate to as well. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. Which is amazing. It's a beautiful, simple statement of that trusting God to do all the things that we can't do, and even to wait for him to deliver on the things that we're hoping for. That's so enduring. I think that's everything else around it could be obliterated, and we could have rebuilt over all the other ruins, but that hope, that sort of dramatic climax in the middle, I think just stands forever, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really, really does. And I'm glad you pointed that out, Ben, because it is really the only hopeful verse in the whole of Lamentations, I think. And I think you're right that it is almost like at the high point of the book, which is ironically in the middle, as you said. Interestingly, just to add to that, I was taken with the last verse in chapter 5, the last two verses, where it, in a sense, you've highlighted the high point of the hope, and yet the book finishes on an uncertain verse, or an uncertain sense, where it says, "Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may renew our days as of old." I love that. But then just at the end of it, it says, "Unless you've utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure." And I just thought that was...
Amen, church!
Yeah.
Woo, let's go out on a high.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure.
But
bye.
But the reality is that's so the way it is, isn't it? When we're low, when we're suffering, when times are difficult, we kind of vacillate from this. Yes, God is my protector. God is caring for me. I'm going to be fine. It's going to be okay. And then the next minute, you're full of anxious thoughts. But as long as we haven't offended God in some way, and have we angered him beyond measure, there's this kind of vacillation that goes on, isn't there, in our psyche? And I think it's quite encouraging. I think for those of us that suffer, and when we're suffering at different points in our lives, and if you're listening to this and you're suffering at the moment, what you should know first of all is that God cares about your suffering, because this book would not be in the sacred book of the Bible if it wasn't really important to God. It gives dignity to our suffering, and it acknowledges the kind of topsy-turvy, undulating, difficult roller coaster of a ride suffering can be. Hope one minute, despair the next. But as you say, Bern, the high point of the book is that God will restore us, and that's exactly, of course, what we start to see to some extent, this hope emerging and blossoming in the book of Daniel. But did you want to say anything more about Lamentations before we move to Daniel?
No, that's a good place to jump. I mean, it does end in an odd place, what would be very odd to us, partly because it's ancient, but also I think because it's real. That people haven't resolved all their suffering and tied it all up with a nice, neat little answer to hum on the way home. It's a real thing, and so then the events of Daniel are in that context, and I think Daniel's a fascinating book. It's almost like to me it's almost like a selection box. So we're coming up to Christmas. It's not just a book. It's like a pack of all of your favourite kinds of things. If you like anything in the Old Testament, there's something. There's like a bit of each in Daniel. There's a bit of story. There's a bit of history. There's some very, very memorable characters. There's also some very memorable prayers and worship. There's some amazing, mind-blowing prophecy, and some mysteries. Frankly, things that we think people probably would have got their heads around in the centuries after Daniel, but some people still aren't sure. So people still think there's stuff in there that's still to be unpacked. Who knows? But we've got quite a lot to unpack in there. I think both of us, as we were thinking about it in advance, our mind drifted back to Sunday school, though, didn't they? Because Daniel it's a good place to go mining for stories and images if you've got to teach some kids something. What do you remember from Sunday school about Daniel?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those stories of Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel's friends being in the fiery furnace, just being in the fiery furnace and not being burnt, and then both of those sort of events kind of demonstrate, if you like, the special nature of Daniel and his friends, and so consequently the Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, they're super impressed by this, and so they elevate Daniel and his friends to positions of authority in the kingdom of Babylon, in the royal court of Babylon, which is a fascinating thing to see. But yeah, those sorts of things kind of writ large in my memory from Sunday school, because they're such like as you say, there's such memorable stories, and and they speak perhaps of God's protection over us and God's provision for us, right?
Yes. Now, hold on. I just want to speak to the person who's listening to the podcast at the moment, who's a bit worried. They're in the process of taking off their headphones because they're thinking, "Oh no, Owen and Bern are going to ruin another Bible story for me." They keep talking about how things were in Sunday school and how now they think it's completely different. And so, what are you going to tell me now about Daniel? Are you going to ruin it for us? No, I don't think so.
No.
Because
be reassured.
No, be reassured because this has only grown on me, certainly as an adult. But I think I've seen more and more in it, perhaps like richness in it that is very hard to communicate at a Sunday school level. That's how I would relate to Daniel. You know, one of the things that has always puzzled me as I've thought about this as an adult. Like, I think as a kid, it's easy to just see Daniel as a hero, right? Because he's super, super full of faith. And that's clearly the message. Not questioning that he's full of faith and has a lot of things going on. I'm also struck by the fact that because he was plucked out of the young, bright people in the people from the people of Judah, he was plucked out as in the way that the Babylonians did. To take the best people that they could and mould them into their own idea of leadership, right? So they would take those people and then immerse them, give them a university education, a royal education, and in the culture of Babylon, and it's always. I think there must have been there were certainly people who really look up to Daniel, like the prophets seem to really like him, and according to the story, you know, people in heaven, the angels, they're all that. They love Daniel. They're always talking about him. I'm just thinking, if I was a regular suffering Jewish person who heard about this story of this guy who was one of us, but now was serving in the royal courts and living this cushy life. I might be a bit more conflicted. I might think, isn't he just a collaborator? Shouldn't the thing we be doing, shouldn't we be defined by something other than that? You know, and shouldn't we be resisting all this? And yet I think I recognise as well, because of what God said through the prophets, that God was calling people not to. God was calling people to engage with their captors and to work for the good of the cities that they found themselves in, and they would prosper along with those cities, and so people must have been all kinds of conflicted about that. So that's what I take from that, I think, and also all these things that make Daniel look full of faith and from God and a little bit like a sort of a proto-Jesus sort of person. They sort of remind me of how Jesus was actually met when Jesus came, doing really amazing things. It wasn't like people were universally, "Oh, you're brilliant, you're from God. Well, we should listen to you then." You know, and I wonder how much mixed reception Daniel had. But that's not the main story of here, is it? The main story is really about the grace that he found from God and all this blessing that God gave him. So what else did you find about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that Daniel clearly is an emblem of faithfulness despite persecution, and given that this would have been written either during or post exile, it would have been written to encourage people to be faithful despite the persecution, because it's easy to forget that although these people were taken off into exile in Babylon, that wasn't the end of big colonial empires coming to dominate these people. Even when they returned to Jerusalem, there was the Persian Empire in the ascendancy. They defeated the Babylonian Empire. After that, it was the Greeks, and after that it was the Romans, and that's just kind of giving you the kind of headlines. You know, there were other little many sort of rebellions, kings, lesser kings that would have sought to exert influence over this really geographically important piece of land that we've talked about before between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And I think that, you know, there is a sense of there is hope in spite of the persecution that I'm talking first person, we, Daniel, and all the Jews feel. There is hope that if we are faithful, God will rescue us. That for me is the kind of the theme that runs through this book. But clearly Daniel, I noticed this, I don't know if you noticed this, but Daniel clearly is getting slightly concerned about and wondering how long is this exile going to last. I think he knows that Jeremiah has talked about it lasting 70 years. It says in chapter 9 that he consults the scrolls and reads Jeremiah 25, where Jeremiah says that. So for Daniel, by the time Daniel's reading this, it's almost been 70 years since the exile started. So Daniel is asking the question, you know, when's this going to end? Is it about to end? And an angel says that Israel has continued to sin, and therefore their exile will last 7 times longer than Jeremiah actually envisioned. Now, although we have a commitment to not read the Bible literally, I think it's really interesting, and I think others will have made this connection as well, that 7 times 70 is 490 years, which actually following the exile would have been about the time when Jesus arrived on the face of the earth. And so I'm sure that others will have noticed that much more than I have. But clearly Daniel's really quite disturbed by that. And I don't know if you noticed this, Ben, but in his third vision, we see this kind of same kind of sequence I've just described: Persia, Greece, with Alexander the Great, the Seleucid king. It was a Greek king, and also a final king from the north who will invade Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple and exalt himself above God. Now, what does that vision refer to? I don't know about you. Have you got any thoughts on that? I mean, yeah. It seems to me that it could actually apply to a number of situations.
Not many, though. I mean, I think most serious scholars are pretty much agreed. They're talking about Rome,
right? And you're talking about Rome's destruction of the temple in AD 70, right?
Possibly, yes. I mean, that's obviously a stretch to kind of nail it to that, given that we know that with our hindsight.
Exactly.
But Daniel wasn't aware of it. You know, it was clearly written down before then. I think though there's a lot of the beginnings of Rome would have been known in the time, perhaps even when, if you know, for the scholars who don't like anything miraculous, don't believe anything could have been written down in advance that we didn't already know, they can cling on to this idea that maybe someone editing the book of Daniel had an inkling that Rome was arising and was this threat that might have sounded a bit like some of the things that they were polishing in their in the post-exile period while they were sharing and promoting this book. We don't know. I'm happy to believe that Daniel just had a vision and God can do that, because honestly, if you can believe any of the other bits, if you can believe that he could survive the lion's den, if you can believe that his mates in the fire could just stand there and not be touched by the fire, and then there's this mysterious other fourth person. Who's that? Could it be Jesus? I don't know. But someone is in there with them just going, hey, chill, guys. And they come out and they don't even smell a fire.
Chill.
That's what they're doing.
They're in the middle of a fire. Chill out, guys. Chill out.
They're in a fire that was so hot it burnt the people who were going to put them in there.
Who were stood around, absolutely, yeah. But that's the point, though. That is the point, isn't it, Bern? That we can take encouragement from this, and I think Daniel does offer hope to future generations. That in spite of persecution, if they are faithful, God will rescue them. And you mentioned Rome. Others have talked about the Syrian king Antiochus in in 160 BC, who did set up idols in the temple. What does it do? Well, I think what it does is it encourages people that there is a promise that God will restore his kingdom, and I think that's a promise that many generations since have held on to, and that's one of the reasons I think why Daniel's so popular.
One of the things I like about that promise is, in the stories of Daniel, you also get to see a bit of how that kingdom works, I think. Because the Jewish people are cut off from everything they think ought to define them. They're famously cut off from their own land, obviously. They were also cut off from the temple. They're cut off from the ceremonial worship. They're cut off from all the things that they think they've been trained over generations and generations that they need to do in order to have their sins dealt with, in order to carry on obeying the law. You know, how on earth could they be God's people if they weren't able to get to the temple? One of the things then that I think springs from Daniel is I'm struck by just how much Daniel looks like a combination of a trusting person, yes, a trusting believer in God, but also a bit of a leader, also kind of a priest, also someone who was faithful and able to get into God's presence and God was able to commune with directly, also a prophet. Someone who was able to hear God's voice and pass it on in ways that could be verified. You know, Nebuchadnezzar gave this unique test of saying, hey, can anyone interpret my dream? And everyone rocks up going, yeah, sure, tell us your dream, we'll interpret it. He goes, no. If you can really interpret my dream, you can tell me my dream as well, can't you? And everyone's like, how does that work? No, we can't do that. And I just love how Daniel was like, yeah, you're right. No one could do that. Oh, God could do that though. and so in everything that Daniel's doing, I love how the kingdom of God is fleshed out. Like you can see because of what's happening with Daniel. You can see because of where he's pointing, because of who he's giving the credit to, because of all the things he's empowered to do. You know, from eating vegetables and still being healthy to being able to pass on words that can only have been from God. He's pointing towards the reality of a kingdom that doesn't need all the other stuff. It doesn't need the temple, you know. So where's the temple? Could it be that this is pointing towards this future in which God has made his temple in people? I don't know actually if this is one of the things that the Pharisees got particularly excited about, and maybe maybe their hope in that was springing from what they were reading about, what they've been inspired by in these prophecies and these stories. I know that they certainly split in terms of their belief from the Sadducees, who were very keen to go, no, it's definitely all about the temple, and while the Pharisees were going, well, yeah, but maybe God's doing some other things. Maybe he's, maybe the temple could be lots of things. I think maybe Daniel is starting to point people that way, or God is starting to point people that way through Daniel, which is a very significant fork in the road. And it's one which ultimately leads us, I think, to Jesus.
Yeah, and I think we had a sneaking idea of that as well. I think Jeremiah was barking up that tree when he described his vision of a sort of mobile throne with the glory of God on it. You know, I've always wrote this kind of like Pope mobile with the glory of God on it. You know, and this is just a vision, obviously, but that sense that the glory of God, the weightiness of God's presence in the temple, the David Solomon temple. When the temple was destroyed, the glory of the Lord went into exile with the Jews. And I think that's quite a profound statement. I think you're right, Daniel builds on that. I find Daniel quite interesting because it, as I said earlier, it's very familiar. Some of the stuff that we read about in Daniel, particularly his visions, and I'm talking more of his visions, are very familiar to us, because I think what we see with the pattern and the promise of Daniel, that is this idea that nations will rise against and will assert themselves, and they will glorify their own power, and they will become violent and evil and brutal, and then they will be confronted by God. I think that hope is taken up by Jesus, and uses images from Daniel to describe and confront the oppression that the people of Jerusalem are living under at that time. I think John, just to take this a bit further, I think that John, who wrote Revelation, also uses images from Daniel to apply them to Rome of his day, to highlight their oppression, but that to embed and remind the Jews and at that time that those would be people who followed Jesus of the hope that they have, that God will confront and destroy these kingdoms in his time. I think that's quite a helpful, I think it helps me understand why we're seeing some of this in the Gospels of Jesus and why we're seeing some of it in Revelation as well, because that's, for me, that's where I see the familiarity with some of these sort of visions that Daniel's having. We see them repeated in the Gospels and Revelation, and I find that really, really interesting. Clearly those people writing at that time, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they clearly were using this repository of writings that were put down at the time of the exile as inspiration and source, almost source for what God would do in their day. It's really interesting. It's a bit nerdy, that, though, I know, but forgive me for indulging myself.
Well, I mean, I think you're reflecting on something which is important, though, because there are people still today who feel that maybe there's something in what Daniel was looking forward to that still hasn't been fulfilled.
Right.
And you could then apply that literally and read all the Left Behind books and go, we ought to be thinking about, when's the real battle going to happen, and is this beast, with the horns? Who is that? Is that the EU? Is that the and there is serious.
Can I just confess, I read that entire series of books and I loved it. It was like 15, 20 years ago, but I really enjoyed those books. They were a great read, and
I really liked the first. I was surprised how much I liked the first one.
Yeah.
The difficulty was they went downhill from there. I
read all of them.
Oh no! Have you seen the film with Nick Cage though?
No, I refuse to watch the film because further on down the road, but more recently, I've kind of looked at it and gone,
it's widely regarded as the worst film of all time.
Yeah.
But you be the judge. Now, is the problem with the acting or with the theology or both? If it's both, we're really in trouble. Where I think the theology isn't quite that bad, because I'm personally, I'm not a believer in the having to look for the signs of the modern age in the particular details of Daniel, but in the overview, in the sense that there is battle going on, I think we carry that sense that this isn't a done deal. This is still a live thing, and I believe that. And I don't know if that means that there's some sort of apocalyptic thing that we ought to be, channeling money into the Middle East so that people can fight it out with weapons. As much as I think the battle that I recognise, the spiritual battle, the personal battle, is between stuff that God wants for us and stuff that is against what God wants for us. And I feel that battle in my own heart. I don't need to take it out to anywhere else or ask anyone else to fight that for me. I can see the frontier here, that there is things that represent God's kingdom and life and goodness and love and joy and peace and all that brilliant stuff that we keep talking about. That's how we know we're seeing the kingdom of God coming. And there's stuff that just opposes that in me. It's selfishness, or it's fear, or it's wanting to just do stuff on my own and not particularly trust God, or to be like one of these foolish leaders who kind of sees a bit of God's blessing. This is who I don't want to be, right? I don't want to be one of these leaders who's seen what God can do and says, "Oh, that's brilliant. I love God. Yeah, we should all love God," and then forgets about it later on. The Nebuchadnezzar in the story of Daniel, I love him for the moments where he looks like his mind is genuinely changed by God. But where God takes him to task is where he doesn't keep learning, where he thinks he's sorted it all out and he's done. And that could be me. I want to feel I've sorted things out and I'm done. I've got to say, I'm not. I'm still learning. I've got to still be learning from God. And as we've gone through the Bible again, as I've listened through the Bible so many times in the last few years, we're nearly finished with this run this year. I felt I've learned so much this year and heard so much fresh in what God's doing and how he's sort of applying it to us and asking us questions of, where do we want to go with this next? What does it mean to us? Where do we want to put it into practice? How much can we trust him even in the things that we don't feel we really understand yet? I feel that battle going on too. I don't know about you, but I feel hopeful in that battle. I feel like God's resourcing us pretty well. How do you feel?
Yeah, I recognise that, and I'm grateful for the opportunity that we kind of we have with regards to redemption and restoration. And I think I might feel like, oh yeah, I've got that sorted until the next crisis hits, and then something hits, and then you go, oh no, I haven't got that sorted. but I think that what I love about it is that the movement of Jesus is all about thinking differently, thinking again, restoration, second, third, millionth chances. There's never is unconditional love. There's never anything to prevent you from stepping back towards what is best for you and best for your relationship with God. And I think that personal application is so important as we talk about this today. But I also wanted to say that I actually feel hopeful. If there's one thing that Daniel reminds me of, it's that God will prevail, evil won't. And even in that we live in a world full of people who like me, that kind of mess up and hurt people and cause pain, but we also live in a world where there are tyrants and dictators who use all sorts of brutal, savage behavior to exert and maintain their power. And just having just witnessed the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, overseeing a regime that used brutality to achieve its goals. It just fills me with hope that Daniel's story fills me with hope that God will bring down these regimes of evil, and I think that we see that in Daniel, and I think we see that hope generally, that evil does prevail. Don't get me wrong, but ultimately there is justice, and that sweetness and that healing justice is part of God's agenda for the world in which we live, and that gives me hope, even when I'm not seeing justice, even when we are seeing evil flourish. I feel this story gives us hope.
Yes.
And I think that's very personal, as well as corporate.
I'm going to take some comfort from the words that a heavenly ambassador gave to Daniel as he was trying to make sense of what it was that God was showing him and what it was God wanted to say to him. And he says, "Do not be afraid, Daniel, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them."
Yeah.
What a combo. That's the combo. I want to gain understanding, but I want to be humble before God as well.
Yeah.
And not feel like I've worked it all out by myself.
Yeah.
And could we be like that? Could we trust then that God's already heard that and he's already come in response? And then when we're looking at situations like Syria, where we have no idea what's going to happen next, this is the conundrum here. It's like, does it mean that the people who've applied for asylum here, they can just go home? Or is what's going to happen next? Could that be worse? We don't know. We can't know right now. And in a similar way, I think we're going to turn the page on the Bible story where we've been, and we're going to look at where things started to be reconstructed for Israel in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They didn't know what was going to happen next. They were full of hope that they could move back in, that they could restore and rebuild, and everything would be even better than before. But they didn't know how it would all work out. And it'd be interesting, I think, to listen back to this with that uncertainty in mind and ask ourselves, is this a story of everything being rebuilt brilliantly and all the glory coming back? Or is this a story of something going a bit wonky, something going a bit weird and wobbly along the way? Have a listen, see what you think. Might surprise you if you have a listen with fresh ears. We'll come back and have a chat about it next week.
Look forward to it. Do have a good time listening. See you then.
Bye.